Hey everyone, don't forget to leave a comment letting us know what you thought about the stories and the narration. We really want to hear your feedback to keep improving and bringing you more chilling content. Now, get ready. Let's dive into the stories. When I moved to that small town in the countryside, I confess I was looking forward to some peace. After years working in the chaos of the city, an engineering project far from the rush seemed exactly what I needed. The town, with its quiet streets and constant silence, seemed like a refuge. But within the first few weeks, I started to feel a discomfort I couldn't explain. There was something in the way people looked at me, like I was an outsider. Despite the forced smiles and welcoming words, my house was modest, simple, but it worked well for me. However, there was something strange about the neighborhood, an almost suffocating quietness. Sometimes it felt like even the birds avoided the area, as if they knew something I hadn't discovered yet. My days were monotonous, filled with work, but the nights were different. During those nights, the exaggerated tranquility started to weigh on me. I avoided thinking too much about it, convincing myself that it was just my mind adjusting to the new routine. That's when I met my neighbors, Marcos and Carla. They lived next door and were the first people to really try to get close to me. Marcos was an expansive guy, always cracking jokes and telling stories of his youth, usually with a beer in hand. Carla, on the other hand, was more reserved, but very kind. From the beginning, our interactions were pleasant, and I started to relax more, thinking it was just a matter of time before I got used to the town. As time passed, our friendship grew. We talked often, and I felt like I was finally settling in. However, there were moments when something made me uncomfortable. I noticed small gestures between Marcos and Carla, as if there was something unspoken between them. They exchanged furtive glances and sudden silences when I was around. Marcos always seemed a bit possessive, especially when Carla spoke with me. But again, I tried to ignore it. I knew it wasn't my place to get involved in their affairs. Maybe it was just the dynamic of their relationship, something that, as a newcomer, I wasn't used to seeing. Even so, it made me uneasy. Sometimes, I found myself replaying every conversation we'd had, trying to figure out if I had done something to provoke that behavior. But most of the time, I concluded it was just my paranoia, the result of boredom and the monotony of my new life. Then, one seemingly normal afternoon, Marcos showed up at my door with a proposal that, at first glance, seemed harmless. "Hey man, have you ever been hunting?" he asked with that typical wide grin of his. "Me and a buddy are going next week. Why don't you join us?" The idea caught me off guard. I had never been much for hunting, but in that town, it seemed like a common activity, almost a rite of passage for the local men. I didn't want to seem disinterested or ungrateful, so despite a slight discomfort, I accepted the invitation. "Sure, why not?" I replied, trying to sound enthusiastic. Carla, standing beside him, smiled, but it was a tense smile. Her eyes, however, told a different story. The day of the hunt came faster than I expected. Marcos picked me up early, along with his friend Claudio, a quiet man with a perpetually stern expression. The atmosphere was odd from the moment I got into the truck. Marcos seemed less talkative than usual, and Claudio barely looked in my direction. The ride to the forest was filled with an uncomfortable silence. I tried to make small talk, but their responses were always vague, like they were just waiting to get to our destination. The discomfort I had felt since the invitation began to grow. When we arrived at the forest, the isolation of the place gave me the unsettling sense that we were far from any help if something went wrong. Still, I tried to stay calm. After all, Marcos and Claudio were experienced in this sort of thing. Maybe I was just overreacting. As we walked through the dense woods, the silence became more and more oppressive. At first, I thought it was part of the focus required for the hunt, but there was something unnatural about that silence. I tried to push the thoughts away, telling myself it was just nerves from being in an unfamiliar environment with people I didn't know as well as I thought. That's when I started to notice something strange. We were moving farther and farther from where we started. I tried to mention it, but Marcos just shook his head, as if I was imagining things. The discomfort grew with every step, but I didn't want to be the guy who ruined the fun. After a few more minutes of walking, Claudio abruptly stopped and looked at Marcos. "I'm going to check out that trail over there," he said, pointing to a path that led deeper into the forest. Without waiting for an answer, Claudio walked away, disappearing among the trees. Now I was alone with Marcos, and the atmosphere shifted completely. The silence, which had already been uncomfortable, now felt suffocating. Marcos stopped walking and, without looking at me, started speaking, his voice eerily calm. "You know, I've always been very protective of Carla." The way he said that made my blood run cold. There was a tension in his words that I couldn't ignore. "She's always been everything to me, and I don't like it when people get too close to her," he continued, still not looking at me. I tried to laugh, nervously, trying to figure out if this was some kind of joke. But Marcos didn't seem to be joking. In fact, he no longer seemed like the laid-back guy I knew. "Marcos, I think you've got the wrong idea," I started to say, but he suddenly turned to face me, his eyes filled with a hatred I had never seen before. Before I could finish my sentence, he pulled a gun from his waistband and pointed it directly at me. Fear hit me like a punch. I tried to speak, but the words got stuck in my throat. "You think I didn't notice?" he said, his voice now cold. "You think I'm an idiot?" My body froze for a second, but my mind was already screaming one thing: run. Without thinking twice, I turned and ran as fast as I could into the forest, the sound of gunshots exploding behind me. The sound of gunfire still echoed in my ears as I ran, my heart pounding and my lungs burning with effort. The trees blurred around me, and the uneven forest floor made every step a struggle. I could hardly believe what was happening. The guy I considered a friend was now hunting me, literally trying to kill me. More shots rang out, and I could hear the bullets whizzing past me. Panic took over, and all I could think about was that I had to keep running. Every fiber of my body screamed for survival, and I felt like a hunted animal. My legs ached, and branches scratched my face, but I couldn't stop. My only chance was to put as much distance as possible between us. As I ran, my mind tried to process what had happened. None of it made sense. What had started as a simple invitation to hunt had turned into a deadly chase. The hatred in Marcos's eyes, his irrational jealousy over Carla. I never imagined he could be this dangerous. The terrain became more difficult as I strayed from the main trail, and my feet stumbled over roots and rocks. I wasn't sure where I was exactly, but I knew I was getting farther and farther away from civilization. A shot passed so close that I felt the air impact beside me, giving me a new burst of energy to keep going, even as my body was nearly giving out from exhaustion. I had been running for so long that I started to lose track of time. The sound of the shots had died down, but I could still hear Marcos yelling in the distance, his voice filled with rage and desperation. Even without the gunshots, I knew he was close. I couldn't stop. The fear of being caught kept me moving. In a moment of desperation, I saw a small ravine ahead. The slope was steep, but I had no other choice. I scrambled down quickly, almost falling, but managing to grab onto branches and roots. The lower ground gave me a false sense of safety, as if I were finally out of Marcos's sight. But I knew I wasn't safe. Not completely. The silence of the forest was deafening, and even the sound of my own footsteps seemed too loud. As I moved cautiously, trying to catch my breath, I scanned the area, looking for any sign of danger. My mind was on high alert. Every sound, every movement of the leaves seemed like a threat. I kept following the ravine, using the uneven terrain to try and lose Marcos. My only hope was to find a way out of the forest before he caught up. Exhaustion was starting to take over, but I knew that stopping wasn't an option. The terror of being captured pushed me forward, even as my body screamed for rest. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw a more open area ahead. With my heart still racing, I ran toward the clearing, hoping this would be my chance to escape for good. When I reached the clearing, My mind was confused, but my body acted on instinct. The main road wasn't far. I started running again, my legs nearly giving out, but the terror of being found by Marcos kept me moving. When I reached the road, I raised my hand, desperately signaling for the first car I saw. The driver, clearly alarmed by my state, dirty, bloody, and out of breath, stopped immediately. Without thinking twice, I got into the car, my words coming out in fragments, but enough for him to understand I needed to get away. I was alive, but the fear hadn't faded. There was no way I could go home that night. The thought of Marcos waiting for me haunted me. I asked the driver to take me to the nearest hotel, where I could finally lock myself in a room and try to process everything that had happened. Sitting on the edge of the bed, dirty and shaken, I couldn't think of anything except escaping that town for good. That night, I barely slept. The image of Marcos, with his gun pointed at me, his voice filled with hatred, kept flashing in my mind. The fear that he might show up at the hotel kept me on edge, but I knew I couldn't go to the police alone. What if Marcos and Claudio had influence there? What if they tried to find me before I could get away for good? The next morning, I called a few friends and asked for help. I didn't tell them the details, I was still in shock, but they understood the urgency. When they arrived in town, we went straight to my house. We moved quickly, gathering all my belongings as fast as we could while I watched nervously, half expecting Marcos to appear at any moment. We didn't spend more than a few minutes there. I grabbed my clothes, documents, and anything valuable I could carry. Silently, we left through the front door, and I knew it would be the last time I ever saw that place. In the car, as we drove away from the town, I felt a mix of relief and overwhelming weight. I was physically safe, but the trauma of what I had experienced would stay with me. The terror of that chase wasn't something I would forget easily. Maybe, one day, I'd be able to talk about it without feeling the fear that still gripped me. But at that moment, all I wanted was to leave that town and never look back. The road seemed to stretch infinitely before us. After so many hours of driving, my body was exhausted, and the darkness around us didn't help. My wife was equally tired, and when we saw the flickering sign of a small roadside motel, we knew we couldn't continue for much longer. The place didn't look great. The facade was old, and the sign flickered erratically, as if it could go out at any moment. The parking lot was nearly empty, except for an old car parked in the corner. I exchanged glances with my wife, both reluctant, but without many options. "I think this is the best we can get at this hour," I said, trying to sound more optimistic than I felt. We entered the motel. The inside was just as desolate as the outside. A bell rang when we opened the door, and we were greeted by a middle-aged man who seemed tired of his own life. His fixed stare made us slightly uncomfortable, but he smiled oddly. "Room for the night?" he asked in a raspy voice. We nodded, and he handed us the key to a room at the end of the hallway, number 12. As we walked there, the silence in the place felt suffocating. Everything was too quiet, and a chill ran down my spine, even though there was no apparent reason for it. The room itself was what I expected: old, poorly maintained, with the characteristic smell of mildew in the air. The bed creaked when I sat on it, and the curtains were so old that they barely blocked the light from the motel sign outside. My wife was clearly uncomfortable, but she was trying to stay calm. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and I knew she felt the same as I did. Something about this place wasn't right. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or perhaps the fact that the motel seemed abandoned, except for us and that lone guest we had seen briefly in the lobby. But there was something more, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. "I hope the night goes by quickly," she muttered as she lay down, pulling the old blanket over herself. I nodded silently, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling. The tension between us was palpable, a product of the long hours on the road, the exhaustion, and being in such a depressing place. Every small noise in the room made my body tense up, as if I was expecting something bad to happen at any moment. After a few minutes of silence, I closed my eyes, trying to force myself to sleep. But I couldn't. The silence of the motel was strange, and the sense that something was off kept me alert, even against my will. That's when I heard the first sound, a distant noise, almost as if someone was walking down the hallway. I opened my eyes and looked at the door. Nothing seemed out of place, but the unease in my chest was growing. The sounds continued. Light footsteps, barely audible, echoing in the hallway outside our room. I sat up in bed, trying to figure out if it was just my mind playing tricks on me due to exhaustion. For a moment, I considered lying back down, ignoring everything, but then I heard a knock. Soft, but firm. I looked at my wife. She was awake now, her eyes wide, and she had clearly heard it too. The knock came again, a little louder this time. It didn't seem aggressive, but something about the way the sound echoed down the hallway made me even more uneasy. I got up slowly, trying not to make a sound, and walked to the door. I peered through the peephole, but there was no one outside. This didn't make sense to me. I was sure someone had been there. I opened the door slightly, just enough to peek into the hallway, but it was empty. No sign of movement, just the same dark and poorly lit hallway, with closed doors and the oppressive silence that filled the place. I went back inside the room, closing the door behind me, my heart racing. "What was it?" my wife asked, her voice low, almost a whisper. "I don't know. No one was there. Maybe it was the wind?" I tried to rationalize, but the feeling that something was wrong was undeniable. She nodded, but I knew we were both trying to convince ourselves of something we didn't believe. We lay back down, trying to ignore what had just happened. But the persistent sound of footsteps in the hallway continued, growing more and more unsettling. I started to wonder if we were really alone in that motel as we had thought. The heavy silence that had once filled the place now seemed to be interrupted by something far more sinister. The sounds in the hallway intensified. Now, the footsteps were distinct, as if someone was pacing back and forth, hesitating in front of our door. The feeling of being watched grew. I got out of bed again, this time with a lump in my throat, adrenaline beginning to pump through my veins. I walked to the door and pressed my ear against it, trying to hear more clearly. What I heard made my heart race. A whisper, very close, low and unintelligible, but clearly coming from the other side of the door. My wife, now fully awake, looked at me with wide eyes. I didn't need to say anything. She knew I was hearing something, and from the expression on my face, she knew it wasn't in my head. The whispers continued, now clearer, as if someone was murmuring something to us. "What do you think is happening?" she asked, her voice trembling. I didn't have an answer, and the worst part was that, for the first time, I couldn't rationalize what was happening. Something was very wrong here. I tried to stay calm and went to the window, peeking outside. In the parking lot, the old car was still there, but now there seemed to be another vehicle, as if someone had arrived during the night. And then, I saw a shadow pass quickly around the corner of the building, disappearing toward the lobby. "We need to get out of here," I whispered, my mind already working on a plan to escape, even though I didn't know exactly what we were running from. That shadow I saw pass by the window was what made me decide. Something much darker was happening in that place, and I wasn't willing to wait to find out what it was. I gestured for my wife to get up silently, and we began to pack our things quickly and discreetly. The fear was palpable, and the longer time passed, the stronger the sense of imminent danger grew. As we finished packing, I heard muffled voices coming from the hallway. This time, they weren't whispers, but low, almost conspiratorial conversations. A chill ran down my spine. I approached the door once more and listened more carefully. They already know too much. It was the manager's raspy voice. My breath stopped for a second. Know too much? About what? My heart began to beat faster, and my hands started to tremble. I knew we had to get out of there immediately, but we couldn't draw attention to ourselves. Suddenly, I remembered the door at the end of the hallway, the one near the manager's office. Something about that area had always seemed strange to me, but I hadn't paid much attention before. Now, it seemed like everything was falling into place. Something was hidden there. I grabbed my wife's hand, and we left the room in silence, walking down the dimly lit hallway. The place seemed empty, but I knew we weren't alone. I approached the office door, pushed it open slowly, and there, in the dim light, I saw something that made me freeze. On the floor, there were drag marks, a broken chair, and dark stains that looked like dried blood. My stomach churned at the sight. I knew we couldn't waste any more time. We were in danger, and there was no doubt about it anymore. We quickly made our way down the hallway, trying our best not to make any noise. Each step was a challenge to maintain control. I could feel the manager's eyes on us, even though he wasn't there. When we finally reached the parking lot, the relief of seeing our car felt temporary. As I started the engine, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw a figure standing at the motel door, watching us. The dim light didn't allow me to see who it was, but I knew we had been noticed. We sped away from the place, not looking back, but the fear still clung to us. The silence in the car was heavy. My wife, her hands trembling on the wheel, was in shock, just like I was. As we drove down the dark road, I began searching for information about the motel on my phone. With each search, more disturbing details emerged: disappearances, inconclusive investigations, hushed-up stories. We knew we had escaped, but what we had seen in that motel would stay with us forever. The terror of that place would follow us, even after we had left its parking lot behind. Returning to my grandmother's house always brought mixed feelings. On one hand, there was the comfort of familiarity, but at the same time, something about the deep silence of that rural area made me uneasy. It wasn't just the isolation, it was the emptiness around, as if the world had stopped there, among the old trees and vast fields. This time, Lucas, my older brother, was with me. He was always the figure of safety, but I knew that his impulsiveness, especially in tense situations, could get us into trouble. As we walked up to the porch, the wind blew softly, but the air felt dense, almost oppressive. My grandmother's house was the same as always, with its weathered wooden walls and the comforting creak of the floor with every step. But for some reason, I couldn't stop thinking about the shed at the back of the property. Ever since I was little, I avoided going there, never quite knowing why. Maybe it was the way it always seemed to be in the shadow of the trees, or the fact that its old, rusty door creaked as if calling someone. At dinner, my grandmother, with her calm demeanor, mentioned that she had been sleeping poorly, feeling that something strange was around. Nothing very clear, she said, but, these feelings. It wasn't a statement to be taken seriously, but somehow it stuck with me. The discomfort seemed to grow as the night wore on. Lucas always laughed at these things. "Grandma's just being grandma," he said, while fixing the porch light, which flickered intermittently. To him, these subtleties meant nothing, just old people superstitions. But I couldn't ignore it. There was something in the air, like low electricity, almost imperceptible, that kept me on edge. As Grandma went upstairs to her room, Lucas and I stayed in the living room, trying to distract ourselves with a card game. But it was hard to focus. The sound of the wind outside seemed to come alive, hitting the windows in an irregular pattern. Lucas noticed my discomfort and, without taking his eyes off the cards, said, "Relax, man. We're in the middle of nowhere. Who would come here?" Maybe he was right. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks, fueled by Grandma's comments. Even so, I couldn't help but notice how he always took the lead, as if he was in control of everything. That confidence, which in other situations reassured me, this time made me uneasy. He had this tendency to want to solve everything on his own, without stopping to think. That had caused us problems before, and I feared it might happen again. Later, near midnight, I heard the first sound coming from the shed. It was a soft creak, like something being moved inside. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably just the wind hitting something. But then I heard it again, louder this time. I looked at Lucas, who was now alert too. He closed the card game and stood up, heading to the window. "I think there's someone out there," he said, in a calm but firm tone. My heart raced, and suddenly, the discomfort I had felt during the day turned into something more tangible, a sense of impending danger. We stood still for a few seconds, trying to understand what was happening. I approached the window next to Lucas, peeking out toward the shed. The moon cast a faint light over the property, but enough for us to see a figure moving slowly inside the shed. Whatever it was, it didn't seem natural. The person, or whatever it was, moved strangely, almost as if dragging something. "Do you think it's an animal?" I asked quietly, though I already knew the answer would be no. Lucas gave me a disapproving look, as if I were being naive. He didn't say anything, just left the window and headed straight for the cabinet where our grandfather's revolver was kept. My mind raced. Maybe it was just someone lost? A neighbor seeking help? "Lucas, wait. It could be someone from around here. Maybe they're just looking for shelter." Shelter in the shed? At this hour of the night? He had already made up his mind. There was no convincing him otherwise. He put the gun in his waistband and opened the front door. "Let's see what's going on. If it's someone with bad intentions, I'm not going to let them stay around." Reluctantly, I followed. Something inside me told me we shouldn't go, that we should just lock the doors and wait until morning. But as always, Lucas didn't listen to my concerns. He was already determined to handle this his way. We walked slowly toward the shed, the sound of our footsteps muffled by the soft earth. The wind was blowing stronger now, and the feeling of vulnerability only grew. The shed looked much bigger in the darkness, its silhouette looming under the pale moonlight. My heart was pounding, and the air around me felt heavier, harder to breathe. We reached the shed door, and Lucas, without hesitation, slowly pushed it open. The creak that echoed was enough to send a shiver down my spine. He drew the revolver, and together, we stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, with only small slivers of moonlight filtering through the cracks in the old wood. My eyes took a moment to adjust, but soon I saw the figure inside, now standing still, with its back to us. "Hey, who's there?" Lucas shouted, his voice firm. The silence that followed was suffocating. The figure didn't move, just stood there, motionless, as if it hadn't heard us. "I'm talking to you." He took a step forward, aiming the gun. Finally, the intruder began to turn. When he did, whatever courage I had crumbled. The man, thin and disheveled, with dirty, torn clothes, looked at us with a disturbing smile. His eyes, partly hidden by the shadows, gleamed in a way that sent a chill through me. "Lucas," I murmured, trying to warn him that something was very wrong, but he didn't hear me. He kept his gaze fixed on the man, gripping the revolver tightly. "Leave now, or I'll shoot," Lucas threatened, but the man didn't seem fazed. He just took a step to the side, still wearing that empty smile. "Lucas, it's not worth it." I tried to convince him, but he was already set on his decision. Lucas's finger moved to the trigger, and then a gunshot rang out into the night. My heart almost stopped. Lucas had fired at the ground, a warning shot. The sound echoed off the shed walls and disappeared into the night air. The man finally reacted. Slowly, he turned and began walking toward the exit, without saying a word, without looking back. He simply walked away, calmly, as if the shot meant nothing to him. We stood there, frozen, watching as he vanished into the darkness of the forest. The quiet that followed was unbearable, and in that moment, I knew this wasn't over. Back in the house, the silence felt even heavier. Lucas didn't say anything, but the tension in the air was palpable. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with trembling hands while I tried to calm my own racing heart. We couldn't just ignore what had happened, but we had no idea who that man was or what he was doing there. Grandma was awake when we came in. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen, watching us, her expression suggesting she already knew, somehow, that something had happened. "What happened?" she asked, her voice soft but serious. Lucas recounted the incident, his voice steady, but I could hear the unease hidden behind his words. When he finished, Grandma just nodded, as if this was something she had expected to hear. "This isn't new," she said, almost to herself. "I've been feeling like we're being watched for a few weeks now." Her words hit me like a punch in the gut. The idea that the man could have been lurking around, watching the house without us noticing, was something I couldn't fully process. How many times had he been here? How long had we been watched without knowing? Lucas tried to reassure Grandma, saying the man wouldn't come back, but I knew he was wondering the same things I was. The silence that night, after what had happened, was far more terrifying than any confrontation we had faced. The next morning, the sun was shining, but the light didn't bring the relief I had hoped for. Lucas and I went out to the shed to see if the man had left any trace of his presence. We looked for footprints, marks, anything that could help us understand who he was and what he had been doing there. But we found nothing. It was as if he had never been there. "What do you think he wanted?" I asked Lucas, as we stared at the line of trees surrounding the property. The silence was heavy, almost oppressive. "I don't know," he replied. "But if he comes back, we'll be ready." I wanted to believe that. I really did. But the man's disturbing smile, the way he looked at us without fear, stayed in my mind. It was like he knew something we didn't. Maybe he was just testing our reaction that night. Maybe he was waiting for the right moment to come back. Back in the house, Grandma was quieter than usual, as if she also knew that this wasn't over. And as I prepared to leave, the feeling that something was unfinished followed me. I took one last look at the dense forest that surrounded the property. The sense of being watched, which should have disappeared with the morning sun, was still there, persistent and oppressive. I knew, somehow, that he was still out there, watching. Since the moment I entered Maple Hollow, something felt off. It wasn't just the silence of the streets or the sense of isolation. There was a certain unease in the air, as if the entire town was holding onto a secret that no one wanted to share. I had come here to investigate a series of disappearances, stories that had barely made it to the media, and this was my chance to uncover something important. As I walked across the main square, I saw children running and residents chatting on their porches, but as soon as they noticed me looking, the smiles vanished quickly, their gazes turning away. It was subtle, but enough to make me suspicious. Sheriff Wallace was one of the first to greet me. With his calculated smile and that paternalistic attitude, he made sure to reassure me. "Accidents happen around here, but there's nothing to worry about. The town is safe," he said, his voice controlled and firm. But there was something in his eyes that bothered me, a glint of someone who knew more than he was willing to reveal. And of course, the fact that he seemed to show up everywhere I went, as if he was always watching, didn't help. As the day wore on, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Something was out of place in Maple Hollow, something they were determined to keep hidden. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, but I didn't know exactly what it was yet. In the days that followed, I began asking questions. Maple Hollow, as welcoming as it seemed on the surface, was full of closed doors and evasive answers. Every time I mentioned the disappearances, the atmosphere immediately changed. People who were once willing to talk suddenly grew uncomfortable. An elderly woman, with tired eyes, could barely hide her worry when I brought up the subject. She gripped my arm tightly and whispered, "You should leave while you still can." That stuck with me. Should I have listened? Of course not. It only made my curiosity grow. I continued my interviews, and soon it became clear there was a pattern. All the accidents seemed to involve people who, in one way or another, challenged the community. A woman who questioned the town's administration died in a fire. A farmer who refused to follow orders vanished during a hunting trip. These were not coincidences. But every time I tried to dig deeper, Sheriff Wallace would appear, as if he knew exactly where I was at all times. It wasn't until I decided to visit the local library that the pieces began to fall into place. The library, like the rest of the town, had an air of abandonment, but it hid something. In the dusty archives, I found documents, old news clippings that pointed to something far more sinister. It was all there if you knew where to look: accidents following a pattern, an eerie silence echoing through the years. I was definitely getting close to something, and the closer I got, the clearer it became that someone was always nearby, watching. After digging through the files in the library, things started to come together in a disturbing way. There were too many accidents for them to be mere coincidences. Every death or disappearance involved people who had challenged some authority in town, especially Sheriff Wallace. It was as if Maple Hollow had its own justice system, where defying power led to tragic consequences. And the scariest part was that, based on the documents I found, this had been going on for decades. I knew I had to be careful. The deeper I dug, the stronger the feeling that I was being watched. The next day, as I left the library, that feeling hit its peak. Looking around, I saw a car parked across the street. It looked ordinary enough, but something about it caught my attention. The driver. He was sitting there, staring straight at me, as if waiting. My hands shook as I closed the library door. I decided to head back to the hotel, but as I walked, I glanced over my shoulder, and there he was, following me. Panic began to rise in my chest. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just paranoia, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this car was tailing me, waiting for the right moment to strike. The night was falling, and everything seemed quieter, more oppressive. The dim streetlights cast long shadows, and the town began to feel like a maze of suspicious stares. When I finally reached the hotel, I locked myself in my room and tried to gather my thoughts. Everything I had discovered was leading to one conclusion. Sheriff Wallace and his accomplices were deeply involved in something much bigger, and I was in their way. The next morning, I knew I needed more answers. I went back to the center of town, trying to interview more residents, but no one wanted to talk. That's when I approached a younger man, working in a garage. He seemed more willing to speak, but when I mentioned the sheriff, he clammed up. "You don't know what you're getting into," he said, glancing around as if someone might overhear. "These disappearances, they're not accidents. Wallace runs everything around here, and if you cross him..." He didn't finish the sentence, but the fear in his eyes said it all. Before I could ask more, my phone rang. The voice on the other end was low and threatening. "You'd better stop this. Don't get involved in things you don't understand, or you'll regret it." Panic hit me hard. They knew where I was. They knew what I was doing. I looked around, but I couldn't spot anyone directly watching me. The town seemed both crowded and empty at the same time. Every person felt like a threat. Every shadow, a spy. I knew I couldn't trust anyone. The car that followed me the previous day, it was parked just a few meters away. I was trapped. I knew too much. The only option now was to run. But even that seemed impossible. If the sheriff and his allies truly controlled everything in Maple Hollow, how would I escape alive? I knew I didn't have much time. The threatening voice on the phone and the terrified look from the man at the garage made it clear I was in real danger. It wasn't about uncovering the truth anymore. It was about survival. The first thing I did was run back to the hotel and grab my things. I had to get out of Maple Hollow before it was too late. As I drove along the deserted roads that cut through the town, I sensed something was wrong. My heart raced as I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the same car that had followed me the day before. It was back. This time there was no doubt. I was being chased. Adrenaline surged through me, and my first instinct was to speed up, but the narrow, dark roads were no place for a high-speed escape. My eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, watching the car stay close behind. The tension in my body was so strong that my muscles began to ache. I knew I needed a plan. Driving aimlessly wouldn't save me. I remembered a small, out-of-the-way motel, a discreet place where I could stop for a few hours and figure out my next move. When I finally arrived, the place was almost deserted. The receptionist barely looked me in the eye when I asked for a room. I locked the door to my room and immediately grabbed my laptop. I had to send everything I'd found to someone I trusted, someone who could act quickly. As I typed frantically, the panic grew. What if they already knew I was here? Minutes later, I heard footsteps outside. At first, I tried to ignore them, but the footsteps grew louder and closer. My body froze. Someone was out there. With my heart pounding in my chest, I ran to the window. It was narrow, but it was my only way out. With trembling hands, I managed to open it without making any noise. As I slipped out, the cold night air hit me like a punch, but that was the least of my worries. My feet touched the ground, and I knew there was no time to hesitate. I ran into the darkness without looking back. I escaped Maple Hollow that night, but what I left behind still haunts me. Even after sending all the evidence I had gathered, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being followed. I constantly look over my shoulder, expecting Sheriff Wallace or one of his men to reappear at any moment. Because deep down, I know they never let anyone go that easily.